Yeah.
There's a very interesting incident or series of incidents that takes place in the parashas we're reading now, which is an opportunity to study a deep aspect of marriage. So let's try to think about that. I'm sure many of you are thinking about selecting a suitable marriage partner at some time. So let's see if we can get an insight into a facet of marriage that's not usually understood. The Torah says that when Avram and Sarah, the original prototype, if you like, of Jewish marriage, the mother and father of the Jewish people, when they crossed the border into Egypt, he says to his wife, Avram says to Sarah, wherever we go, please tell them that you're my sister. Right? That needs understanding. And in fact, she does that, and on 2 occasions, she's taken away from him on the assumption that they're not married, that she's his sister. Pharaoh takes her away. Abimelech takes her away. She's saved from being molested by them and returned to her husband. And as if that's not enough, it happens again in the life of Yitzchak. In the next generation, Isaac, when he's traveling, so again he's required to say that his wife is his sister, and that needs explanation. The simple story, of course, is that they knew they were going to places of tremendous immorality, sensual, marital type immorality, where a beautiful woman would have been taken by force, and if she was married, they would think nothing of killing her husband. And therefore, the simple strategy was that he would say that she's my sister, and therefore, instead of killing him, they would negotiate, right? And they'd pay maybe, and buy his sister, and give him gifts, and that would save his life. So the simple storyline is that as a strategy to save his life, in all of these cases, the woman said, Rivka said about Yitzhak, Sarah said about Avram, that she was his sister, and that in fact was necessary, and it saved their lives. But obviously, Torah is always dealing with something at a deeper level, something much more essential. And the fact that there was a psychological strategy or some sort of clever ploy that they used, is really not the issue. I mean, everything in Torah always is something of essence. It is never simply a practical strategy, right, or a practical stuff in the world. In fact, even in the Talmud, I think Gemara, where it tells you seemingly practical things about business or about medicine or about health, they're always deeper. Right? The Torah is not a textbook of practical strategy, and therefore there has to be something deeper here. What's the deeper message of a man calling his wife his sister? Right? That's the first question. A second question we could ask is that calling his wife his sister is very problematic, because you cannot marry a sister. That means the suggestion of a marital relationship between brother and sister is a very problematic thing. And that raises many questions. One of the questions it raises is the fact that the world in fact began by brothers marrying sisters. Right? There wasn't anyone else to marry. When Adam and Eve were created, Adam and Chava were created, so the children, right, in the next generation, Cain, for example, Cain was born with a twin sister, and the Medrash actually says that the reason he was born with a sister the reason that there was brother and sister was so they could marry each other, so that Adam didn't have to marry his daughter. In other words, brother and sister were born together so they could marry each other. And that's very problematic. If it's a prohibition and spiritually extremely negative for brother and sister to marry, then why did the world begin by brother and sister marrying each other? If you say, well, there was no one else, so like the world had to get going, so it was kind of allowed. There's no way that the world began, right, in its moment of inception and purity with something that is extremely problematic. Right? At the very least, it would mean that all of us are very deeply illegitimate in some way, illegitimate in the Jewish sense, right? Not very, very problematic. Mankind began at its level of purity even before man sinned, with brothers marrying sisters, which is a very problematic relationship. What does that mean? In fact, the name we give that is we call the key, the phrase that's used is Olam Chesed Yibaneh. Olam Chesed Yibaneh. The simple meaning of that phrase is that the world is built on kindness. Hashem, God's kindness, produced the world. But Chesed in Hebrew has two meanings. It has one meaning. The one meaning is unlimited giving, outpouring of self and giving. So one application of that word is kindness, when you give of yourself. And another facet of the same word is sexual immorality, which means giving with the inability to say no. It's giving by giving everywhere, without being able to put a loyal limit on where the giving is. And so the Torah calls immorality, marital immorality, calls it chesed. Right? Again, the word is neutral. The word means giving with no limitation. The good side is giving of yourself with no limitation. You give kindness, give of yourself. The bad side is giving yourself in relationships that are improper and unlimited. So the simple meaning is the world was built on kindness. But another layer of meaning is the world was built on immorality, meaning on brothers marrying sisters, right? What does this mean? What does this mean? So there's a fundamental message in marriage here. And that is that really every man should think of his wife as his sister. I try to understand this. You know that original couple that formed the Jewish people, when is this statement made? The statement is made as they cross the border. They're traveling from Israel to Egypt. Right? From Canaan, which is Israel, the place of spiritual holiness, a land that cannot tolerate immorality. The Canaanites were evicted because they behaved in a very, very depraved manner. But it's a land of holiness. And they move from this land, it's called Eretz HaKodesh, the land of holiness. They move into Egypt, which is the land of marital impurity, right? The Torah calls it Erva Sa'aretz. You can't even say that in decent or clean English. But it means a very, very unseemly and sordid place. Right? A place where the values were values of adulterous immorality. And as they meet that challenge, they cross the border from the place of sanctity to the place of contamination. At that borderline, which is a threat to marriage, at that moment they assert their brother-sister relationship. The meaning is this. Husband and wife. We have a very deep concept that husband and wife at the highest level are actually one person. The way this is taught in the deep sources is that in its most intense form, when Adam and Eve were created, they were fused as one. Or rather, they were one. Right? The Gemara says that they were actually an androgynous being. Adam was really Adam and Eve. There were two faces. Interesting discussion in the Talmud about which part of the body was him and which part of the body was her. and if there were two faces, which way did they walk? Who walked forwards? Who walked backwards? Oh, yeah. Interesting discussion. But the point is that they were a fused male-female being. The simplest way to picture it is that one side was male and one side was female. And there was, of course, no back. You understand what this means? Man and woman were formed as a male-female fused unit, and when they were brought down to the world, they were torn apart. That's a Kabbalistic process called the Nasira. Nasira means being ripped apart. And they were brought down to the world to face each other and become one through their own effort. Meaning that the simplest level of understanding is they were once one, taken apart, and given the work of fusing into one again. First they were one with no effort, and then they were brought to the world to make the effort to become one, so that the oneness that would result is no longer the gift that was given before, but it's the result of the work of having fused into one. And of course, the meaning of this is that you cannot really become one unless you were originally an intense oneness. Right? You can say this in many ways. One way to say it is this. The Gemara says, why does a man long to get married? So he longs to get married because he's looking for his lost object. Let's say she was a rib. Right? She was created from the side of man, from his rib, let's say. Right? I mean, one of the meanings of that, of course, is that you know that man was created from the dust of the earth, soft material. Woman was created from a rib, bone, right? Tough, hard as anything. That should be obvious. But she was part of him. So the Talmud says a man longs to get married because he's really looking for the part of him that he lost. You only long for a thing if you have a relationship with the thing. You wouldn't long for something that's got nothing to do with you. You long for something that is deeply part of you, and you're incomplete without that thing, because it was once part of your completeness. And therefore, marriage is a reconstitution of that original oneness. And the reason they're torn apart is to long for each other, so that they have the motivation then to fuse back into oneness. But there are many facets to this. One of the facets is that when they were fused originally, and they stood back to back, so there was no back. That one way to understand that is that in Kabbalistic writing, the front is always the side of Kedusha, or sanctity. The back is always the side of contamination and darkness. Right? You know that the front is always the side of uniqueness. For example, the face is uniquely recognizable. What's one of the outstanding features of a human being, unlike all other aspects of creation, is that a person is uniquely recognizable. The Gemara says the miracle of it is that we all come from one original couple, and yet each of us looks completely different. Even identical twins, if you know them well, you can tell them apart. So that people coming from the same original genetic combination, and of all the billions of people, 6 billion people and many more billions that have lived, are absolutely unique to the extent that you can recognize a person from the face, but only the face. The back is not, even though you're sometimes very suggestive that you can recognize someone on the back, but it's unreliable. The face is unique. By the way, that's why the face needs no clothing. There's no shame in the face. The body has shame and needs to be clothed. The face, because it represents the human uniqueness, which is an image, a reflection of the divine oneness, just like Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, each human being is absolutely unique, and it's the deep reason why humankind began with one human being, right, and not a tribe, one individual. So the face is always the place of uniqueness. The face is also the place of recognition, of relationship, and it's also the place of outside that shows inside. The face, not just the front, but the face, is a place, the Hebrew word panim, which means a face, also means an inside. It has two opposite meanings. The word panim in Hebrew means an outer face, and it also means panim, an inside. Now, the face is that outer aspect of you that shows the inside. The deepest aspect of the face is the eye, and the eyes in Hebrew, the word ayin in Hebrew means an eye and a wellspring, a well, right? Where a spring, hidden water underground, becomes visible, right? Comes to the surface and becomes visible. That's what an eye is. And therefore, the face is always the side of productivity, recognition, relationship, uniqueness. The back is always the side of darkness, unrecognized, lack of recognition, place of excretion. The Hebrew word for the back is achor. Achor is the same word in Hebrew as acher, which means a stranger. It means foreignness, otherness. By the way, it's very interesting. The face is the place, the front is the place of relationship, where man and woman facing each other become one. That means there's a relationship, right? When people see each other and they bond, that's a becoming one. In Hebrew, it's very interesting. That's a facet of oneness, and the back is called achor. In Hebrew, echad, to become one, and achor are the same word, just one letter difference. Echad ends in a dalet, and achor ends in a resh. And those two letters are almost identical in Hebrew. The only difference is a dalet is two lines like that, and a resh just curves the angle. That's all. That's the only difference. Right? And the Kabbalists speak a lot about this. But one meaning is that echad means when two things mesh into each other. How does that work? Because the first two letters of the word ach mean to become one, to stitch together. In Hebrew, the word ach, la'acher, means to stitch. When you take something that is one, let's say if you take two pieces of material and stitch them together, the Hebrew word we use for that is tefirah. Tefirah means a stitching. But when you take one piece of cloth and you tear it, and then you reunite it, the verb we use is la'acher, to stitch together, right? You have to study Hebrew. If you don't speak Hebrew, there's no hope for you. No, you never approach Torah without the language, right? Next Wednesday night you don't come to this class, you go to the Hebrew reading class, and then you'll get somewhere. But la'acher means that you take two things that were once one, separated, and you reconnect them into a oneness. That's called la'acher. So ach means to stitch together, and dalet, the last letter, the Maharal says dalet means four, because actually echad means uniting the four aspects of the world. But another meaning is that dalet always means something that has nothing of its own. Dalet in Hebrew, dal in Hebrew means poor, poverty-stricken. So the reason two can become one is because each one annuls himself. When two people enter a relationship and neither one is asserting his ego in contrast to the other one, they can become one. But if you have ach and then a resh, in Hebrew resh means rosh. That means an assertion of leadership. It means leadership, it means being a... When two people come together and each one's asserting his own ego, then you cannot become one. Then you become foreign to each other. Each one's identity remains separate. But when each one annuls his ego, then you can make a oneness. So the word ach in Hebrew means to bond together, and that is, it should be obvious. It should be obvious that the word for a brother in Hebrew is ach. Brother is ach. Hebrew is achot. When he calls his wife his sister, husband and wife calling each other brother and sister, what's really going on is that this couple who were once one in the spiritual world are now brought down to the material world as two, and their function is to reassert the oneness that they originally experienced. That's exactly what brother and sister are. Brothers or sisters, or brother and sister, are two people who were once one in the higher world. They were once one in the generation of the parent. They come from the same parent, and they're two individuals. So the brother-sister relationship is uniquely a relationship of two separate people who share a common origin in the parent's generation. And that's exactly what husband and wife are supposed to be. They're supposed to be two people who are separate, and they were once one in the spiritual world before they were brought down. The Gemara says that before birth, 40 days before conception, a voice goes out in the spiritual world and announces who's the wife of whom. At least who's what we call bashet, set up to be the right partner. Doesn't mean you'll necessarily find the person. It doesn't mean that you'll be successful. It doesn't mean that you'll stay with them. Even if you do find them, all options are open. But there is an individual that is set up to be, right, to be the complementary half. And it's announced before birth, and of course it is. Because in that world there's already asserted or established the oneness, and in this world they have to find each other and mesh back into that oneness. So the original situation is there's no back, there's only two fronts. The beauty of that is that there's only front. Front is always the side of sanctity and elevation. The back, the side of darkness, is not expressed. Of course, there's no excretion in that world. There's only the side of perfection, and there's complete oneness. There's even one deep spiritual source that says that when two people stand back to back and they're fused like that, the metaphor you can use is like two street fighters who are caught in an alley by a group of thugs who attack them. They instinctively stand back to back so that each one can defend the weak. The vulnerable side is no longer vulnerable because it's protected by the other one. Right? That means that these two people are fused this way. The beauty is that they're fronts only, and there's no vulnerability or place of attachment of the dark forces. The disadvantage is they can't see each other. The problem is there's a oneness, but there's no relationship. There's no there's no pleasure and work and achievement of having become one. And therefore, what happens is they're torn apart. Torn apart has the beauty of being brought face to face so that you can build a oneness, but it has the terrible danger of a back that is exposed. That's the situation in the world. Therefore, ideally a marriage, now the language is so telling. The Rambam talks about how Jewish marriage, after the Torah was given, what becomes the law of marriage. And he starts in a remarkable way. He says, before the Torah law was established in the world, he says a man went into the street, saw a woman, they decided they wanted each other, and they moved into a private situation, they moved into a house together, into a home, and that was marriage. There was no sanctification or ceremony or process or documentation or giving of rings. And the language he uses is, when a man saw a woman, right? Bashuk, that's his language. Shuk means, in English you say, in the street, in the marketplace. What the Rambam means, why does he have to tell you that? Why is it important where they meet? Why does the Rambam have to tell you that in the ancient world, when a man saw a woman, they saw each other in the street? Who cares where they saw each other? Maybe they saw each other in the, local butcher, I don't know. Or place where men meet women, where there's a psychedelic... Anyway, the point is, he could have seen her anyway. The point is, he's talking about an environment that is public. Public means one of the masses. Right? And then they move into a private situation together. Jewish marriage is never called man and woman, it's always called man and wife. Right? We talk about ish ve'ishto. We talk about a man and his wife. Meaning it's a unique individual. We're not talking about simply man and woman. The non-Jewish law of marriage, or the law as it was before Torah was given, that marriage was constituted simply by a couple living together. And divorce was simply when they split. That means, in English you call that common law marriage. The couple would set up a home together, live in isolation together. That would already be a marriage, to the extent that if someone else would have a relationship with this woman, that would be called adultery. And divorce was constituted by public acknowledgement of having split. That's all. After the Torah was given to the world, our marriage is a completely different thing. We call it Kiddushin. Kiddushin doesn't just mean that two people set up a home together. Kiddushin means that there's a sanctity right? There's an elevation. There's a sanctity. That's the concept. It means, and we call it man and his wife. In other words, there's a reconstitution of that uniqueness that was once one in the spiritual world. And therefore, this original Jewish marriage, this original couple that sets up the Jewish people, as they move into the zone where marriage is challenged, you're talking about Egypt, which is the worst of depravity, then they define their relationship as a brother-sister relationship. And therefore, that's the message. The message is that's what a marriage is supposed to be. Right? You know that ideally, before sin brought the whole intimate apparatus into a level of shame and embarrassment that needs to be covered, the ideal marriage was between brother and sister. That was ideal. Right? The world did not get going with a relationship that's very problematic, illegitimate, or the world got going with the most perfect relationship. The most perfect of all was two human beings who were actually one before they were torn apart. The original human couple was Adam and Eve, Adam and Chava. They were actually one body, separated and given the job, the work, to fuse back into one. In the next generation, it's not one body, but it's brother and sister. Twins are born. Cain is born with his twin sister. And the world, the beginning of the human race is formed by these two people who are separate, but originally one, fusing into each other. Nothing could be better than the relationship between brother and sister. After that area crashes into the world of, as we know it now, with that area, we're talking about a world that people didn't wear clothing. Right? In that original world, there was no shame. No clothes were necessary. In that world of purity, the best relationship possible was between brother and sister, right? Because there you are forming that original oneness and reconstitute. Now we can't. Now that area becomes fraught with difficulty, and now it can only be done between people who are not related. That needs more discussion, but that was an ideal. It wasn't a problematic relationship, it was an ideal relationship. And now, of course, that cannot be done. There's still echoes of that in the world. For example, the Gemara says it's good for a man to marry his niece. Right? One of the reasons that's given is because they have a more natural affinity for each other. Many sources say we don't do it anymore and we shouldn't. Some sources say because there may be genetic issues, and since we don't live on a level where we can live with trust, that's not relevant. So it's a discussion whether it's ideal or not ideal. But reconstituting a oneness that has a natural base, right? Of course, it has a dark side as well. Know that the dark side is in a world where it's forbidden. So a relationship with a sister is very problematic. And one of the problems of that relationship is that, you see, one of the downside of living in a world where you cannot marry your sister is that you can't marry your sister. The upside is that you form a bond with somebody who's other than you, who's not related, right? In one way, that's a special bond. A person who marries his sister in this world, as we live in it now, that's a very problematic thing. It's as if to say, I don't need a completion from outside of myself. Right? The most intense version of that, of course, would be somebody marrying his mother. Right? The Gemara says that some of the idolatrous kings, they express their anger and their bitterness and their rejection of God by marrying their own mothers. What that really means is, the two versions of that is a man marrying his mother, a man marrying his daughter. Both of those, the person having an intimate relationship with his mother, what it means sounds bizarre to us because we live in a world where that is regarded as bizarre. But the meaning of it is that I, so to speak, create myself. I don't need anyone outside of me or my point of origin to create me, which sounds weird, but the original idolaters function on that level. Pharaoh said about himself, Li yo'eri v'ani asisini. Pharaoh said, the Nile is mine and I created me. Pharaoh said. Is that person raving? You're talking about a supreme intellect. Meaning, I'm the point of origin and I don't need anything outside of myself. Marrying a daughter is the same issue. When Lot had a relationship with his two daughters, and out of that 2 nations were born, and the firstborn, the oldest girl, went so far as to name her child for this relationship. She called him Moab. Moab means born from my father. Right? And she's very, very heavily criticized for that, because it's a very shameful relationship. But what was she thinking? Because what she was thinking was there's a high side in it. Right? The dark side is having a relationship with his daughter means that I don't need any completion from outside of myself. If there's a woman who's needed to complete me, I produce her as well. In other words, when a man marries, then there's an admission of incompleteness. in the Hasidic world, some of the great Hasidic teachers used to give apples to their students, and to the unmarried boys they'd give half an apple. That's who you are. You're only half. Right? You need completion from outside of yourself. And a person marrying his own daughter is making the statement that the completion that I need to fulfill myself, even that I produce myself. Right? She's from me. That's the dark side of this, of course. And that's why those who practice that did it deliberately to make that statement. There's another facet to this, of course, and that is each human being is born unique, as we said. How does this uniqueness arrive in the world? Why is each person unique? Why is each person the whole world unto themselves? And the reason is because they're born from a relationship of two people who were once one. It's fundamental to understand this. The reason each person is born in this sanctity of Jewish marriage is so unique and is completely and utterly irreplaceable. There never was and never will be another person like this individual, is because he has that uniqueness, because he's born from a couple, right, who are actually originally a oneness. That's a remarkable thing. And therefore there's this unique facet to each person who's born from that, right? You know, it's very interesting that a person who lives an animal existence, a person that's got no spirituality, right? So the Rambam, the Torah literature refers to such a person as a min. For example, a person who's a complete atheist, denier of all spirituality, is called a min. The word min actually is conventionally translated as an atheist, a denier. The literal translation of min means a species. A species, right? That means the person's being demoted to the level of a species. But what's telling in it is, a species is a thing that's always regarded as a group. And animals live in a group identity. There's no uniqueness, right? It's also the reason that animals have no shame about intimacy, right? There's no sense of shame, it's a nakedness. And human beings have a certain privacy, and the reason is because it's uniquely elevated and private area. So that's the concept. That's the concept of the origin of Jewish marriage, right? This concept called bashit. People talk about a bashit, right? Bashit doesn't mean that there's someone out there with, like, you know, your name on their forehead, and when you meet them it kind of flashes, you know. Bashit means simply that there is a person, ideally, who is the perfect complementary half, let's say. And of course, again, there's no guarantee that you'll find the person. There's no guarantee that it'll be a good marriage necessarily. It doesn't have to be a good marriage. It could be a very difficult person to bring out the best in you, right? It could be. Sometimes it could be a marriage between two people who are bashert and it collapses because they're not successful. Sometimes it could be the two people who are not bashert actually are married and they make it work. We have no way of knowing in our very low generation where that uniqueness is, right? But that's because the world has gone through successive demotions and we've arrived at a very low place. But in theory, at least, that's the high side of it. And ideally, we're looking for, right, that opposite half, so to speak, which is the complementary half of each individual. Bashet does not mean destined. Some people think Bashet means your destined partner, right? We don't believe in destiny. Destiny means that you can't avoid it, right? Destiny means no matter what you do, right? In a Greek drama, you have a destiny, right? Oedipus is destined to marry his mother and kill his father. No matter what he does, he's going to end up marrying his mother and killing his father. We definitely don't believe in destiny. Bashet does not mean destined. It just means set up with the potential to be actualized. If we believed in destiny, then there's nothing you could do ever to change it, right? If your marriage partner were truly destined, and that means you absolutely are going to end up marrying her, then what's the problem? All you do is walk out to the street and grab the first thing in a skirt. Doesn't guarantee much these days, but something that's sort of more or less female, and then you could get married and it would be guaranteed to be the right one. It's not what Bashet means, right? We don't believe in destiny. We believe only that there's a potential that could be actualized, and many things could interfere, could get in the way, but that's the unique idea. Just before closing, just to mention one more, perhaps unless you have some questions, but just to mention one more facet of this, is that when there's another facet to the marriage of Abraham and Sarah, and that is where they're buried. This marriage continues after death, right? This is an eternal marriage. So what happens is when she dies, Abraham buys the Machpelah. Right? He buys the cave in which he and Sarah will be buried. And that cave is a place of unique marital resting, so to speak. First of all, the word machpelah means a doubling. Right? It means a male-female combination. The word machpelah in Hebrew means a cave that is doubled. So the Gemara discusses, is it one cave above another cave? Is it one cave within another cave? But it's two, right, in Hebron. By the way, the word Hebron means a connection. Where's the machpelah? In a town called Hebron. Hebron means, chaver means to bond. So Hebron is the place, in Kabbalah, it's one of the two places where heaven and earth meet, where the ultimate spiritual and ultimate physical worlds meet. And that point of meeting is called the machpelah, the cave that is doubled. And who lives in that cave? Who's buried in that cave? All the couples. Avram and Sarah, right? Adam and Chava, Yitzchak and Rivka, Yaakov and Leah. The couples are buried in that cave. It's a place of eternal oneness in marriage, right? Where what is actually being buried there is human beings who are maritally one, from whom a resurrection, a real birth will take place, right? The Maharal points out that when the resurrection of the dead takes place, in Tchias HaMesim, all the dead souls will arise through the machpelah. Right? You want to know where in the world would you stand to see the dead being resurrected? Right? Not Bushy, but in Yerushalayim, in Israel, and at the machpelah will be, according to Kabbalah, the bodies will be taken underground and come up through the machpelah. Why the machpelah? That's the place of connection, where soul and body are again put together, and therefore it's a unique place of doubling. And so in that doubled cave, which is a place where heaven and earth are meeting, that's where husband and wife, so to speak, are meeting, and that's why it's so important to him to go and buy that cave. According to one opinion, that was the 10th ordeal that he faced. The conventional listing of the ordeals. His 10 ordeals, Avram's ordeals. The first one was to leave your birthplace and your father's home and so forth. The 10th one was having to sacrifice his child. But at least one opinion holds that the pinnacle of his tests was after he sacrificed Yitzhak and Sarah died, that he tried to buy the machpelah and he had difficulty. He had to pay a lot of money for it. Right? And he knew that this was his, and it was an ordeal to have to go through. By the way, the sages point out that there are only 3 places that belong to us with no argument at all, that the non-Jews cannot argue about at all. Israel they can argue about, in case you hadn't noticed, right, whether it belongs to us, they can argue. But there are 3 places that don't belong to us because of God's giving it to us, but because we bought them. Right? The 3 places are the machpelah, right? He paid a very high price for it, personally. It was his own personal acquisition. Again, he owned all of Israel because God promised it to him. But in practice, he did not own it. But the machpelah he owned because he bought it. Right?
But nowadays, the outsider majority.
Yes, right. They don't give us credit for anything nowadays, right? But there's one place we have a reference that we actually, our claim here is not that God gave it to us and therefore we deserve it. Our claim here is we bought it and we have a record of that, right?
So they bought it off us?
If your problem is that they occupy places that should belong to us, there are a long list of those, right? You could start with Yerushalayim where the temple's supposed to be.
Mm.
Right? But be that as it may, that is a place that was bought by Avram Avinu. The other place is where Joseph is buried. And the third place, of course, is what King David bought the site of the temple, right? He actually acquired that. So those clearly belong to us in a personal fashion, right? And therefore, by the way, very interesting. The Chaim of Brisk used to point out, very interesting, that when Yaakov was coming to be, when Yitzchak was coming to be buried, Esau had problems, right? Esau had problems with the machpelah, right? Why did he have problems with it? Why did he claim that it belonged to him, that he had a right to it? Interesting. He claimed that not because he had no right to claim it as a son of Yitzchak, right? That he inherited it, or Yitzchak. He had no right to claim it as an inheritance, because all the inheritance of Avram was given to Yitzchak only. Esav and Yishmael were excluded completely. But he felt he had a claim on it as inheritance of the money of his father. Again, as divine promise, that was taken away from him, right? That was given in the Jewish line. But in terms of a personal acquisition of Avram, where he actually paid money for it, so Esav thought, I have as much right to that as any other son or grandson. Okay, interesting. But that is and therefore the machpelah is not simply a convenient place to be buried, right? That is the place of eternal, let's say, planting of human beings. Anyone who has a sensitive ear understands that. How's a Jewish marriage established? Right? So there are 3 methods you can use. How do husband and wife establish a legal bond of acquisition in Jewish law? There are three ways, right? Kesef, which is money, shtar, which is a marriage document, or intimacy. That's the appropriate assertion of a marital bond. Today we use money, a ring, let's say, giving of consideration. That's what it is. And these three methods actually represent the right, the left, and the center. Kabbalistically, three different ways to get married. But what's very interesting is when the Talmud says, how do we know that a man can marry a woman? And the method that he can use, the method of acquisition is money. How do we know that? That means if he gives her a ring, and in return she gives herself into his marital connection. How do we know that? So Talmud says, because we learn it from the field of Ephron, from the Machpelah. Very interesting. Again, here we have the Talmud's teaching you, how does a Jewish man marry a Jewish woman? So what he does is he gives her value, money, a ring, whatever it is. And she willingly accepts that. She now becomes completely, utterly bonded to him in an exclusive relationship. How do you know that that's the legal mechanism? Says the Gemara, we know it because Avram bought a field from Ephron and he gave money. And the Torah uses the same word in both places. That's called Gzera Shava. In other words, it works like this. When a man takes a woman, the Torah expression is ki yikach ish isha. When a man takes a woman, the verb is taking. The same word taking is used by the field in which the Machpelah exists. When Avram, right, this is a basic area of the Gemara in Kiddushin. When Abraham bought the field, the same word is used. Now we have a technique in Torah learning where the same word is used in two places, and we have a tradition that those two words are linked. It means that the laws of these apply there, and the laws of those apply here. Right? After all, the Torah is giving you a clue that the two areas are linked. Therefore, how do we know that giving money acquires maritally? Because Avram gave money and acquired the field. And since we know clearly that he gave the money and bought the field, and the same word taking is used there as is used by, is this clear? By marriage. So therefore, we can learn, although the Torah doesn't say you marry a woman with money, but since it codes in the same word that is used elsewhere where money is involved, if you pay her money or give her a ring, and she agrees, that would be marriage. So the beginner approaches it and he says, well, the Torah doesn't want to duplicate information, right? So how does it compress the information? All it says when a man takes a woman and simply uses the same word that it uses in a monetary transaction, and this case of money is clear money was involved, so you know that you marry her for money. But when the Torah chooses to link those two areas with the same word, it isn't just convenient. It isn't just a convenience that here was a monetary transaction. Obviously, something deeper is being taught here. And that deeper message is that when a man marries a woman and affects the transaction by money, exactly the same thing is taking place as when Avram buys a field. Right? And what does that mean? That the way he acquires the field, again, it's obvious that this is a field that is not simply an acquisition in real estate, but it's a marital situation, because the two of them will be buried together in that field. The Talmud puts it like this. It says when a man gets married, the woman is the man's field. The woman is the man's field. After all, that's where plantation takes place and growth comes from there, right? She will produce the fruits, right, in this marriage. But think about it for a moment. This is not a field where wheat grows, where seeds are planted and wheat grows. This is a field where people are planted and a resurrection grows. You're talking about an eternal relationship. You're talking, what better source could there be for learning Jewish marriage than this place where the couple, when they die, are buried together. What will come out of that is an eternal life, right? In absolute and eternal bond. That's the hint and that's the clue. And therefore, what we study this evening is an insight into a very seemingly side point. You know, this married couple are going into a place where people are ready to kill. She was an extremely beautiful woman, Sarah, one of the most beautiful women who ever lived. She echoed the beauty of Eve. And when Avram Avinu knew her beauty, he said to her, look, a woman like you, they're going to kill me. And therefore, to save my life, tell them you're my sister. Right? So that's the practical story. But of course, the message, the deep message is that what they're teaching us at the beginning of Jewish history, that original Jewish marriage, is that when you move out into a world of marital immorality, right, and we live in a world, in case you haven't noticed, right, that is absolutely sunk, steeped in immorality, right, where the sanctity of marriage is very, very, very problematic. So in that world, we are establishing a bond which is a brother-sister bond, which means a reconstitution of an original oneness, right? That was once a unity in the spiritual world, and then those two partners in this world are reestablishing that oneness. That's some of an insight into the Torah's sources of marriage and the original oneness that we're striving to reform. If there's any questions about anything that I can answer, maybe, yeah.
When you were saying about you sort of buy when you get the ring, well, it's quite common to give the ring and propose rather than when you're actually married. So technically, legally, you're married already when you're
so
engaged.
let me explain this. In Jewish law, we have like this. We have what's called today in the conventional world an engagement. That's meaningless Jewishly. You can't believe me. You have a party. Well, let's just go through the stages. You have the first stage is what's often done. You have an engagement party. That's cool, and it's a party, but it's got no legal significance. Sometimes people write a vort, as you say, which is a promise to get married. You can have penalties written in and so forth. But the first real stage of acquisition in marriage is giving an object of value, typically a ring, and it should be a simple ring so that the woman knows what it's worth, so there's no misunderstanding, a lot of technicalities. If she accepts this value from him and bonds herself in marriage willingly in exchange for this, that's a marital bond. Today we do that under the chuppah, not when we propose. If you ever find yourself in a situation where a young man proposes and actually gives you a ring and you take it maritally, that's very problematic. That's actually a marriage in Judaism.
It has to be a ring.
No, he can do a dance for you. He can stand on his head, provided it has value. That means you would pay to buy a ticket to see him stand on his head. But it has to have value that's at least a pruta, which is about a penny or 2 pennies, right? At least. So conventionally it's a ring. There's Kabbalistic significance to that. But we do that under the chuppah. So we have like 2 stages to a Jewish marriage. Not the engagement, that's irrelevant. We have what's called the giving of the ring, that's the first step. And we make a bracha, a cup of wine. And then a few minutes later we do the second component of Jewish marriage, which is actually moving into a home together. That's the chuppah with the Sheva brachas. There are 2 stages. In old times, in Talmudic times, they used to separate those by about a year. There would be the kiddushin, who would give a ring, and they would be bonded to each other. Any outside relationship would be adultery, very serious business. It was a full marriage, except they didn't live together. It was a year to prepare and acquire the things they needed to set up a home, and then they would move in. That was the second part of marriage. Today, for many reasons, we do both of those within 5 minutes of each other. So the convention we use today is under the chuppah. The boy gives the girl a ring, and she acknowledges that it's for marital purposes in front of 2 witnesses, and then we have a break. Conventionally, you read the ksubah, something like that, to signify that there's a break in the 2 parts of the ceremony. And the second part is the second part of the marriage, which is actually, he takes her into his domain, which is the chuppah, which is like a home. True, in his home, she walks around him 7 times to say, really the one who gives you a place to be? Okay, that's something you have to do. Yeah. Yes, any other questions? Yes.
Could you give please the answer of Rabbi of Christ about Esav request of Nahat Machpelah you speak about?
Yes, he pointed out that the reason...
What is the answer?
That's the answer. Why did Esav think he had a right to this place since he had been disinherited? In other words, Avram gave everything he had to Yitzchak. Yitzchak gave everything he had to Yaakov, right? Which means Esav is excluded and Yishmael is excluded. There's no inheritance to them. So why did Esav come along and claim that he has a share in the Machpelah? Right? He never claimed a share in Israel. He went to live in another place. He went to live in Har Seir. God gave him that as his inheritance. So they've got no claim on Israel. How come he thought he had a claim on the Machpelah? So the Briskerov explains like this. Because his claim on Israel, he knew he'd lost, because his father did not give it to him as an inheritance. Right? As the special spiritual legacy of the Jewish people that God had promised to give him. But what his father had bought, so that's like any father. He paid money for it, right? What your father buys and becomes his, when the father dies, it becomes the son's. So he said, I'm as good as any son when it comes to what my father bought. I can't claim a spiritual inheritance because God did not, and he knew that, and he didn't want it. That's very beautiful insight into that, right? Yeah. Yes, please.
Can I ask why he said it was his sister? Why he wanted Sarah to say she was his sister?
As opposed to? His mother?
Anything else?
His mother? His daughter? What?
Yes, anything else.
Because sister is the word achot. The word achot means 2 that are one taken apart and stitching themselves back together. That's what achot means. you understand? Again, the perfect relationship in the world of two people who are separate but share a common origin is brothers or sisters or brother and sister. There's only one better than that. That's Adam and Eve, who were one and became that. There'll never be that again. That was the original human couple, right? And therefore they are. That is why they are. That's the brothers. By the way, just beautiful to know this. Beautiful, and once you hear it, you see it becomes obvious. The Gemara says, the Torah says, in Shir Hashirim it says, Achot lanu ktana, we have a young sister. We have a young sister. The Jewish people, we have a young sister. Achot lanu ktana, we have a young sister. Who's our young sister? Says the Medrash, Avram Avinu, Abraham. He's our young sister. Why? Because he stitched together heaven and earth. Meaning that he came into a world that was separated. What does it mean he was separated? The non-Jews were teaching that if you want to be spiritual, you've got to leave the physical behind. If you want to be a high spiritual person, become a monk or a nun. Don't get involved with sensuality. Don't drink wine. As soon as you involve with the sensual, you'll be brought down into it. And therefore, to this day, the non-Jewish spiritual teaching is you've got to remain above the world. In Christianity, marital intimacy is considered very problematic, sordid and problematic and definite, right? And we call it Kiddushin, holiness. Because he came to the world and he said, you people are teaching that the physical world is one thing, the spiritual world must be kept separate. From now on, we make a path in the world where we elevate the material to the spiritual. And they said, you're crazy. You try to get stuck into the material and the sensual and the wine and women and all that stuff, it'll bring you down. He said, no, we're going to bring it up. And to this day, that's our path. And that's why in Judaism, all the mitzvahs are physical activities, and you have to get married, and you have to drink wine. And if you don't use some aspect of the sensual world of pleasure, it's a sin. You have to use it right, of course. But that is what's unique about us. So he was this unique individual, and why did he do it? Because his deepest obsession was Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Hashem is one. And the original world showed spirit in body in a perfect harmony. Now that's been crashed into a separation. And to this day, the non-Jewish world has not accepted that. To this day, in the East, in the Far East, in Christianity, in virtually every religion, the teaching is that if you want to be spiritual, you have to leave the physical behind. Right? And our teaching is that if you leave the material world, you're a sinner. You've got to engage in the material, even though it's difficult and problematic, and mesh the two together, right? And therefore he is our young sister, meaning bonder, the one who bonds two opposite things together, namely God and the world, soul and body. He uses the soul to elevate the body. It's a unique aspect. Just say one word about this. The perfect aspect of this in Judaism is drinking wine. Drinking wine. Because wine is a substance that if you use correctly, it elevates the spirit. You use it incorrectly, it makes you part of the scenery. Right? Banishes the mind completely. Very dangerous. Look at the non-Jewish world's relationship with alcohol. The non-Jewish world, throughout the world, their relationship is either total abstinence or total overindulgence. It's a massive problem. I don't think there's a country in the world where you can buy a drink legally if you're under like 21, 18. Like, you've got to be 18 to drink. In Judaism, the kid's 8 days old, we put wine in his mouth. They're like, like every Shabbos, they go, what's the problem? Like, is there a Jewish home where a kid can't drink? And do we have a problem with it? In Judaism, is there a problem of drunkenness? Absolutely not, right? The reason is because wine, the God of Vilna says, wine is the unique substance, the only category of substance that is part of the material world, but it is having a quality of the spiritual. Namely, all material things get worse with time. All material things get worse with time. Machines, the body, they all grind down and wind down with time. Spiritual things get better, like judgment and wisdom. Wine is a material thing, but it gets better with time, not worse. So wine, and that's why the word yain equals the word sod, which means the secret world. When the wine goes in, the secret is revealed. That's what it means. And therefore, we are uniquely, so when do we use wine? At every moment of attaching material and spiritual. Shabbat. The week joins the Kiddush of Shabbat, cup of wine. Brit Milah, taking the most physical, sordid aspect of the body and giving it a holiness, there's a cup of wine. Etc., etc. Marriage, potentially the most, again, sordid of human activities, and we're calling it Kiddushin, there's a cup of wine. Every time we go from material to spiritual, we use wine. Havdalah is exactly the same. Because Havdalah, you're going from Shabbat down into the week to spiral up to a higher Shabbos next week. Right? So that's our bond. It's always very, very deeply significant that we are using wine. In fact, you cannot make Kiddush on Friday night unless you have wine. Or at least bread, but Yes.
I think I just missed the whole point.
I'm not going to say it again.
Yeah. So, like you said, like brother-sister have a connection, but that's like a physical connection to the mother.
Sorry?
Whereas husband and wife,
Yeah.
you're looking for a spiritual connection.
They both have spiritual and material connections. They're
How?
both, the point is they come from a common origin. That's the point.
Whether
Brothers-
that origin is physical or spiritual.
Yeah, brother and sister have a unique relationship. They're born from the same place. That's an amazing thing. They have an understanding and a relationship because they
But
share.
aren't there different souls that come into brother
Absolutely.
and sister? It's not like husband and wife where you're looking for.
Husband and wife have different souls.
Yeah, but but we're all parts the same. If husband and wife are, if brother and sister are parts of the same soul but different, and
Yes.
husband and wife are different, then there's no difference between anybody, husband and wife, brother and sister, or friend.
That's exactly the point. We share that in common.
But that's with everybody, whether brother,
You
sister,
mean we
or
all
friend.
come from the same original?
Yeah.
And that's
so then
why-
why do we have to distinguish between?
And that's why in the Messianic age there'll be an absolute and perfect unity of all human beings. We will reconstitute the one human being who started the whole process, absolutely. But for now, you're doing pretty good if you can just bond with like a husband or a wife, like reasonably, like that's a good start, right? That's where it begins.
But why
By the
don't
way,
we look for a unique one? Because we're all one.
You mean you could marry anyone?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Go right ahead. Go right ahead. As long as he's male.
In theory.
As long
why
as he's
not?
male and like suitable,
Jewish.
absolutely, he'll turn out to be the right one. When you meet him, send him to me. Yeah. Any other? Yeah.
You say that two souls would be Hashem before they've even started this life.
Yeah.
But they may get married.
Yeah.
And then it may still work.
Yeah.
Why would they be Hashem in the first place?
Hashed means that, again, there's another half. It's like this. When you come into the world, your potential perfection is waiting for you in the world. Whatever you need, all the tools, including a wife. Now you have to make the effort to go and actualize it, right? You lie in bed reading the newspaper and think it's going to happen. You have an obligation of using your free will to actually build it. But you need to know you brought into the world with that potential waiting for you. That's what it means. There's no guarantee that it will happen. It's up to you. No? That's what Bashir means.
Yeah, but if what you're saying is that you find that other person, and you go, you marry them,
Yes.
then it still doesn't work.
Of course it may not. You may be a violent type who, does nasty things. You may not work at it. She may be problematic. She may be a lady who needs a place to park her broom. When she comes home, she may be a problematic type. That's human free will. You can mess up perfect relationships. And you can take very unideal ones and make them work. That's up to you. There's no guarantee that you'll be successful in your earning a living, friendships, marriage, etc. But the potential is there. Again, it doesn't have to be a happy relationship. There was one rabbi in the Talmud whose wife was like awful. Like really problematic. So the student said, Rabbi, why don't you divorce her? He said, I wouldn't give her the pleasure. On the other hand, there was one great rabbi, the Tzanzarov, right? He was a genius, absolutely amazing. I'll just finish with this. Amazing. He was a Hasidic leader, and he was extremely learned, amazing character. And when he was a teenager, he already showed genius in Torah learning. It was very special. So, but before I tell you the story, I'll just tell you another story about him, about marriage, to show you his genius. When he was about 18, there was a very rich man who had a daughter who was proposed for this young, brilliant rabbinic scholar. So the father interviewed him, like as was the way, like test him, see what his learning was like. So the father said to him, you want to marry my daughter? Here's a test question. Here's my question. We know that when Adam married Eve, so he asked him a marriage question. When Adam married Eve, we know that they married with fully halachically correct process. With all the details. It says, for example, that Hashem made her beautiful, he plaited her hair and brought her to Adam like it's a mitzvah to make the bride beautiful. Every detail of the marriage was fulfilled correctly between Adam and Eve when they got married. So he said like this, Jewish marriage needs two witnesses. A Jewish marriage is completely invalid unless there are two kosher witnesses. When Adam married Eve, there were no witnesses. So how could it be a valid marriage? You hear the question? For a Jewish marriage to be valid legally, there's got to be two witnesses. And the Talmud says clearly, Adam married Eve with all the legal requirements. But they were the only two human beings around. So where were the witnesses? That's what he asked this young fellow. And without a moment's hesitation, he said, the reason's obvious. He said, the Talmud says the reason you need 2 witnesses, why do you need 2 witnesses in Jewish marriage? To testify that the lady's married. So no one else can marry her. It would be illicit relationship. But there weren't no one else in that world, so he didn't need the witnesses, right? He didn't marry the girl anyway, but that was what he wanted. But I'll tell you what happened when he married the girl, when he met the girl that he did meet. What happened was it was proposed that he would meet this certain young lady, and he was ready to get married, but he had a lame leg. He was a genius in learning, but he had a physical disability. He had a lame leg. So the girl heard about it, and she said, I don't want to meet him. Why should I start a relationship with somebody who's physically, limited? So he said like this. He said, ask her to meet me just once. And if she then doesn't like me and doesn't want to continue, I will not push the point at all. Just once. So the girl agreed. So as soon as they met, he said to her, look, you know why I wanted to meet you once? Because I just wanted to tell you that before we were born, you and me, 40 days before we were conceived, our souls in the spiritual world, I was shown you. I was shown who my marriage partner was, and it was you. But I noticed that you had a bad leg. So I said to Hashem, you know what, Hashem, give that to me. So she married him, okay? And that's the way to handle women. Anyway, any other question? Yeah.
With Yaakov, each of his wives,
Good question. Yes, great question. The question here is that Yaakov married 2 sisters. Can I just add to your question? Avram said that Sarah was his wife twice, by Paro and by Avimelech. Yitzchak also said that Avram said that Sarah was his sister twice. Yitzchak said that Rivka was his sister, right, on one occasion. By Yaakov we don't find that. But he married 2 sisters. And the answer is absolutely. Those 2 sisters were actually one. The partnership between them was very intense. And both facets of those 2 women were needed for him. And by the way, he was also 2 people. Yaakov was also 2 people. Which 2 people? Come on. Yaakov and Yisrael. Yaakov had 2 personae. He was a lower person called Yaakov and a higher person called Yisrael. And he married 2 women, a lower woman called Rachel and a higher woman called Leah. And that was the bond that was needed. Why is a long story, how it worked out and why it was necessary, but exactly. And therefore his life partner was both Rachel and Leah. Right? They were 2 people who were sisters, and he was 2 people in one. And this has very deep meanings. I can't now go into what it means, but that's a very good observation, very good question. Anything that I can answer? Last question. Okay, so this is the idea, this is the mitzvah, and therefore the practical aspect of this, of course, perhaps next time we meet or some other time we should talk about how you make the selection, how do you know if a person is suitable, what are the steps one should go through, what are the issues that are important, perhaps we can talk about that, but this is the beginning of that discussion.